that will discuss the timeline feature of family diagram. So here I've got this diagram of a mock family that I created just to illustrate some principles of how to use this app and how to use the chronology features. So the main idea is that everything possible in the diagram, in the family data model that's underneath the diagram, has got a date attached to it. And that positions that datum in time. So, for example, a person has a birth date and a death date, which marks the beginning and end of their life. And then there may be an adoption date, and there may be any number of arbitrary dates that pertain to the rest of their lives. So, when possible, dates are shown here in text just for the built-in events for people, namely birth, adoption, death. And then there are also dates for marriages, or pair bonds rather, which currently have a marriage date, a separation date, and a divorce date. For example, this one here has a marriage date and a divorce date. And then if I were to change this from just being divorced to also being separation, you would see another S here for separation and the date in between. So everything has a date, and what that makes possible is having a timeline on the bottom of the diagram, a visual timeline, that has the very first date in the family at the very beginning of the timeline. So this would be the birth, hypothetically, the birth of the first person in the family. And then there's a dot at each point in the timeline whenever there's an event that signifies a change, a visual change in the diagram. So all the way up to the present day. And the date for that is currently being showed in the diagram is shown here in the title bar. So that right now it's showing March 6th, 2020, which is the day that I'm recording this video. Now some of these dots down here are light gray, and some of them are dark, are black. So the light gray ones are events that don't actually correspond to a visual change in the diagram, and the black ones correspond to a point in time which actually makes a visual change in the diagram. And then we have the larger circle, which is a nodal event, and those are meant to stand out because they're more sporadic and more important in family assessment. So what you can do here is you can scroll through this timeline to update the diagram to that particular point in time. And right now, the current day is shown in green here. That's sort of like the cursor for this diagram. But if I drag it back in time, you'll see that as soon as it goes over this first dot, black dot, a change occurs. And you just look at the diagram and you can see it's the birth of this child here. If I go back further, another change will happen over this black dot, and that'll be the birth of that child that was right there. And if I keep going back, then you can see in this space where there aren't any black dots that the ages are updating. So it is keeping the dates in line as much as possible with what's showing on the diagram. But then if I keep going back, so what's happening on this dot, you can see there, if you just go back and forth, you scrub on it a little bit, then you can see in your peripheral vision that that's the divorce for this pair bond here. And then if you go back to the next one, you'll see it's actually the change in emotional process symbols. So this projection symbol disappears and another one appears. And that's because I've marked the end date of this emotional process symbol to be the same date as the beginning of the projection symbol that will appear if I just scrub back over that date. So before the date you see the first symbol, after the date you see the second symbol. And to edit those dates, you double click on that emotional process symbol, or click it once to select it and then hit the inspect button, and that brings up the properties for that emotional process symbol. And there's a start date and an end date here. So you can see that the start date is 10/14/2000 for this projection line. And if you look up here at the date that's being shown, if I scrub back past where it disappears, you'll see that it's showing July 9th, 2000, which is before the start date of that projection that was here, which was October 14th, 2000. So the arrow symbols here, the forward and backwards arrows, are just jump to those discrete steps so that you can animate the diagram without scrubbing. Just going to the next visual change on the diagram, like that. So that means that it will skip over, for example, these lighter black dots. So if I hit the back button here, it's going to skip over this dot and jump to this black one, because these are events that I added in that don't have a defined relationship, a predetermined relationship with a change on the diagram. For example, you might say that someone was hired for a certain job, or or that they reported seeing an event on the news that changed the trajectory of their life, or something like that. You would add that in as an arbitrary event, but the diagram, the app itself wouldn't know how to display that on the diagram in a standardized way, and so that means that if you scrub over this, there's no change on the diagram outside of just the ages that update with every year. So that means that if I hit this back arrow while the cursor is at this point, it'll jump straight to this black dot, which is the previous change to the diagram. And that would be the appearance of this projection symbol. So I could see that by going back to even the next previous dot, which is, well, I'm not sure what it is, because it's actually hard to do this. You have to go forward to see what they are. But if I do go forward from this black dot to this black dot, you can see that this black dot represents the appearance of this symbol. Now, it's important to note that there was a little bit of a blip there, where if I select this symbol and then move forward in time or backwards in time, you'll see that it stays there no matter what. And that's because symbols that are selected, or items that are selected, always stay on the diagram. And that's for technical reasons, that's for usability reasons that I don't need to go into here. But anyway, that's the idea with the diagram, and as you can see, you can just scrub through the history of the family so long as you've entered in enough chronological data. So if I go back to the very beginning, it goes back to the birth date of this person, which is 10/14/1900, and you can see that date's shown here. Hitting the back arrow just ensures that I'm right on that date. Hitting this front arrow, forward arrow, jumps to this date, which will be something else. Let's see what happens. So it's the birth of this other person. And then if I jump forward again, it's their marriage, which is allowed to show up because it has a date set for it. I'm using 10/14 for all the months and days just because this is an example family, but the year is 1919, and that dot corresponds to the appearance of that marriage, which is one way that a pair bond manifests. So just going through time, it animates the family accordingly. So that's the basic visual timeline on the bottom of the diagram here. It's just a quick way to scrub through and jump to a certain date and see what was going on with the family at that point. And I use this when I'm talking to clients. I use this actually quite a bit. I just discovered that naturally in talking to people when I have this diagram open and we're both looking at it while we're just talking through the history. And I've noticed that I often click it and drag it. When they're talking about a particular point in time, they might say, when I was 14, such and such happened. And so, for example, let's see here. Say this is the client. They're marked as primary anyway. And at this date in time, which is August 4th, 2016, they were 65. And then if I scroll back, it updates their date. But say they're talking about something when they were 14. I'll say, okay, what was going on when they were 14? Right, so these people were born. They hadn't quite met. She hadn't gotten together with John yet, which makes sense just by the age. But you can get it. Sometimes you'll see that. Well, let's say hypothetically she was talking about a time when she was 2 or 3. There's an event that happened when she was 2 or 3, and I might scrub through there and see, oh, it just so happens that I've also entered in that the evidence for this, the observables for this fusion had disappeared at that time, and that happened to be the same time that this younger sibling was married, and there was evidence for the fusion here, which had a differential with the fusion that was between her and her mother. It's like, so you could instantly correlate other events with the story she was telling, and that I got that by just thinking, okay, she was talking about when she was 2 or 3, and I might get curious about what was going on at that time, and I'll just scrub the bar back until I see her age get to about 2 or 3, and then just start looking around. And if you've entered in enough data, then you'll start, these correlations can start to pop up, and it can be pretty fascinating when they do. And often one of these observations can completely change the view of the family, because such is science. Here's another example transition where, in this mock case, I marked this as a schizophrenia diagnosis for this person happening about, when was it? When she was 17, so that's a little early, but the idea here being that the entire family, 2 generations above her, I suppose I didn't add in the siblings, but everyone started focusing on that problem and devoting energy to it. And that's what this projection symbol might indicate, that there is evidence of a projection process. And so if you go in and select all of these projection symbols and inspect them, you'll see that they all share the start date of 10/14/1970, because that was the time that corresponds with that diagnosis. And so you go in and add these dates so that you can go back and just start scrolling through and getting a holistic overview of the pattern of this family over time, and start to see connections with one event that you might be thinking about and anything else going on in the family at that time. So this allows you to get a broader contextual chronology of what otherwise would be a very narrow view of a particular phenomenon. Going back to this example, so if this client is talking about an event that happened when she was 2 or 3, without the diagram, or without the assistance of this animated view, you may not have caught or have thought about the relationship between that story and the emergence of this child, and the relationship between all of that and the shift in energy being devoted from, or rather the fusion, if you will, the evidence for the fusion shifting from the daughter and the mother to this daughter and the mother. So the point is to be able to see contextual relationships, and that's what a 2-dimensional diagram with chronological timeline allows you to do. So that's the basic idea of tracking chronological data and then using this diagram here at the bottom, and that's how these events work and are displayed. Now there's another timeline, which is a tabular timeline that accompanies all of this, and it's just another view on the same data, and that's up here with this clock symbol. So if I click the clock symbol, it's going to jump out and show a timeline for the entire family. So this is the combination of all of the events, including the built-in events, the events from the emotional process symbols like projection and conflict, or the evidence of those processes, rather, deaths that are built into people, and arbitrary events. For example, here, this event, it's just saying that there were that reports of behavioral problems emerged in relation to this person. And so what you're doing with this is tracking functional facts. That something was reported as a fact. That there was an alcoholic intervention for this person was a fact. And then getting into exactly whether the behavioral problems themselves are facts is a completely different problem. But in a systems view, looking at functional facts is where you start. So the idea here is that this timeline just gives you another view of this horizontal visual timeline and of the timeline that is implied when the diagram animates. It's another way to look at the same data because you can see different things in the same data when you look at it in different ways. And so you'll notice here that there's a date column that has the date for each event. There's a description for each event. Some of these are built in. Like pneumonia is an arbitrary event that was added in manually. It doesn't show an update on the diagram when you pass over it in time. But it does, when you click on this event in the tabular timeline, you'll notice that this person does pop out. So you can click on an event and see who it pertains to. When I click on this pair bond here, it just animates this pair bond so it draws your attention to it. So it's between these two people here. When I click on this person who is diagnosed with, quote, stress, whatever that may mean, then that person pops out on the diagram. And you can keep clicking in the same manner to just get an association between this tabular format and what's happening here. So this, you'll notice that this event here is pink, at least on my computer it's pink. It may be a different color on yours, but because that varies across computers. But this was an event. If I click on this, this is to signify that it's a nodal event. And there it corresponds with the color here of the larger nodal event circles on the visual timeline. And the way that you set a nodal event is you go in and edit the event that you've added. It pops open the same form here. And just to show that again, you're clicking this inspect button, or you can do Command I, and it inspects that event. It shows the person it pertains to, and it gives you a list of people to choose from. Only the people who have names entered show up in this list for technical reasons. You can set the date here just like in any other object, any other item like a birth date or a death date or that sort of thing. And you have two ways to enter it in. You can type it in here, or you can pick it by clicking visually like this. There's a checkbox here for unsure, which is just a helper for you to say, well, I'm not really sure about this date. I also use the convention of using 1 when I don't know a date. And it's not perfect, but when I see 1-1, it generally means that I don't know what month and day or day that event happened, but I at least want to get the year in there. Or maybe I'll do 3-1, and then I know that it was March, or ballpark was March, but I may not know the day. And then I click unsure sometimes, and that helps a bit as well. And then to clear out of this, to clear this date value, I'll just click this, and it just resets it so there is no date, although dates are required for events. So I'm going to do Command Z now to undo that last change. I've got to go back into it. To edit it again. So I'm going to open up this other event, behavioral problems in Josh, and just get back into this again. So there's a description field, and this corresponds to this column here. You can write in whatever you want, but generally speaking, it's best to keep this as, well, it only allows you to type in 1 line, but it's best to keep that as short as possible. Because the function of this description really is just to differentiate between the events here in the timeline. It's not to give a comprehensive explanation of what happened. that can go into this notes field. So down at the bottom, you've got these tabs, and you can click on notes, and then you can type in whatever you want. This was a really important event because, and then you can type in as many lines as you want. So I always try to put in a location when possible, and then the nodal checkbox is there. And if I click nodal here, you'll see that it updates this diagram and shows it on that date as a nodal event right there. Now, with any timeline, you can resize the timeline to go full screen if you just want to do the tabular view as a spreadsheet. And it expands and adds a few more columns. So let's go back to the normal view. All there is date description and person in the normal view, but if I click resize, you also get the location. You get the date, today's date, or the date rather that event was added to the diagram. I added this because when I was seeing clients, I wanted to be able to go and search and just see the events that I added for a particular session, because I needed to fill out my case notes. At that point, I was entering everything into the diagram, and so it was helpful to go back and write a session note or case note based on what I'd entered into the diagram. So then you've got the log date there, and to search this table of events, you click on this magnifying glass here in the lower right hand corner, and it pops open this dialog where you can filter based on any field, and it's an AND logical operation, which means that whenever you enter in a field, it's going to make only show over here in the timeline the events that match every field that you've entered. So for example, if I clear this out, now it's showing every event again, but if I click nodal, it's only going to show the nodal events, and then the current day event, which is not a real event. That's just a placeholder. But so then if I want to search within nodal events, I can search for, let's say, behavioral in the description, and it just does a string matching, and it only shows me the nodal events that also have this set of letters in the description field. Similarly, if I clear that out, oops, let's start over and do nodal. Now I've got the nodal events, and although it's showing at the bottom now, and if I type capital D, well, there's something going on there. Anyway, in principle, there it would show the letter D for death. It would be able to filter on death, but there's something else I'm not thinking about here that's making it act the way it is. Anyway, that's the idea. So there's a search function there, and that's very, very helpful when you get a very long diagram timeline. So now you'll also notice on this timeline that there's these extra columns here, and these are non-standardized arbitrary variables that you get to add to the timeline in order to track changes along whatever dimensions you want to track. And here I've just got change in symptom, change in anxiety, change in functioning, change in relationship, because these pertain to a particular research model that I was playing with when I was setting up this family. And I'm not going to get into what values you would add in here or what variables. That's completely up to you. But maybe I'll make a video later that just covers research and using the diagram for research. At any rate, if I close this diagram, then I'm back to the timeline, then I'm back to the main view. And there's this gear button here which takes you to the settings for this diagram file. And you'll notice at the very top here is this same list of variables that I had in my timeline. So this is where you add and delete your list of variables that you want to use to research that family. And if you're involved in a fairly rigorous research project, you would probably add in, you would probably define your variables up front in the methodology and then use your variables to track all of the cases in the sample over time. And that just lets you augment, just going back to the timeline, that just lets you augment the data model that's already in there. So the data model that's already in the app, or the app provides to you, is tracking the date, tracking a description, associating each event with one person, also tracking the location for that, and then allowing you to track any number of variables for that event. That is the basic data model that is supported by this app. It is limiting in the sense that, for example, at least the way the app is designed right now, you can't associate more than one person with an event, with the exception of emotional process events that are dyadic. It automatically adds in the two people that are associated with it, or pair bond events, which are married, separated, divorced, and then moves. And so the app does limit you in that way, but that limitation provides for some structure to be able to track systematically. So there's always limitation when you make choice, and that's the data model that the app provides now. So you can just extend that data model with your own variables which pertain to each event. So the same principle applies when you look at the timeline for an individual person. It has the same timeline view. I just double clicked on this person, and then I go down here to the timeline tab. And what you see here is, instead of entire family listed at the top of this timeline, you just have the name of the person that you're viewing, and it just filters all the events down to only show the events that pertain to that person. So this one begins with the birth and death of that person, because I entered in those dates. So the family timeline simply aggregates the personal timelines into one list. But the personal timeline does support the same data model and adds in the same variables here. And all of this is just combined in the family timeline. So if I click the resize button, it just jumps back to the default width, but you can also just pull this out and have a quick look like this if you want, or you can click that resize button and have it go full screen. There are two buttons down here, or three rather. There's an add event button, which automatically adds an event, or adds an event with the person that it's being added to automatically selected, so long as I'm coming from their personal timeline. So right now I'm still in Heidi's timeline, and if I click the add event button on her timeline, then it assumes I'm adding an event to her timeline, and it gives me that standard event add form, but with her automatically selected. So just a little bit of a shortcut there. The other button is in the timeline is the relationship button, and this adds an emotional process symbol. And so you would choose the kind here of symbol, and that corresponds to the list here. And then if you wanted to set the people like this, you could just select them by name, hit the date, etc. And that's just another way to do what you can already do. For example, if I wanted to add conflict between these two, I could do that there with the mouse. So it's just another way to do it. If you select both of these, for example, inspect, go down to the timeline. Now it's showing the timeline for two people here, and it has Harold and Heidi's events combined. So if you wanted to add another person, you just select them and then click timeline, and now it's three people, and you've got Harold, Geraldine, and Heidi all in one view. So you can filter down that way as well. And then if I deselect her and just have the two people and hit relationship, I can add, again, this is another way to add an emotional process symbol, that it automatically has these two people selected. So it's just a shortcut for adding those in another way. So that's pretty much all of the standard timeline features. There's another view which is more visual, a little bit less mature than this bottom timeline view and this tabular timeline view. But if I click this button here, it expands the visual timeline so that you've got a little bit more information. And then this particular timeline allows you to filter based on tags. So I'm not going to really explain very much about this because this is really gets into a whole different domain of complexity in assessment, and that's going to require its own video. But I just wanted to show that there is a more sophisticated visual view hiding under this visual horizontal timeline here that lets you get at the data in a different way yet still. So that's an overview. You've got the tabular timeline, which is the combination of each individual personal timeline in the family. You can expand the tabular timeline to view more data for each event and your arbitrary variables that you may choose to add in a more sophisticated assessment. And then you've got the ability to scrub through the diagram down here with all of the different ways that helps you see the data from different angles. And that's it. And so I hope that that's helpful, and you can look for more videos on the more sophisticated timeline features in a different video. We'll talk to you then. Bye-bye. Good luck.